My name is Daniel Carter, and what I'm about to share with you is the kind of story most people think only happens in movies or courtroom dramas. But this was my life. The day I graduated from law school, cap and gown still hanging on my shoulders, I was blindsided by my own family. They walked into my grandparents' home, with smug smiles, waving papers in the air, and told me I had until Friday to pack my things and leave. The house that had been my sanctuary since childhood, the one place I thought was untouchable, was suddenly under siege. They claimed it was theirs now, their proof. A set of documents I instantly knew were forged. The home was worth nearly $3 million, sitting in a neighborhood where property values had skyrocketed. To them, it wasn't a place of memories or family, it was a jackpot, a payday they felt entitled to. I remember the exact moment my father said it. "You're out by Friday." His tone wasn't angry. It was triumphant, like a gambler who thought he'd finally pulled the winning card. My mother nodded beside him, eyes darting around the room, already calculating the dollar signs hidden in every antique chair, every framed photograph. My sister, half their age but already fluent in their manipulative ways, leaned against the doorway, scrolling through her phone, barely disguising her anticipation. And me, I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled. Because what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that months earlier I had quietly moved every asset my grandparents left behind into an irrevocable trust. The house, the land, the accounts, it was all locked down tighter than Fort Knox. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was the naive son, the one they could steamroll. But they underestimated the years I had spent preparing for this very moment. Standing there, diploma still fresh in my hands, I realized something profound. Freedom isn't always about leaving. Sometimes it's about defending the ground you've been entrusted with. That house wasn't just property. It was where my grandparents raised me after my parents chose greed over responsibility. It was where I learned what love really meant, and no set of forged papers could ever erase that. I'll admit the tension in that room was so thick, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My father's grin faltered for the briefest second when he saw I wasn't panicking. He didn't know it yet, but the game he thought he'd won was already over. I had built a wall around my grandparents' legacy, a wall made not of bricks and mortar, but of law and foresight. This story isn't just about money. It's about betrayal, survival, and the hard truth that sometimes blood isn't family, it's just biology. And while that realization cuts deep, it also carves out something stronger, the courage to stand alone if it means standing for what's right. Before I go deeper, let me say this. If you've ever been forced to defend yourself against the very people who should have protected you, you'll understand the fire that burned in my chest that day. And if you haven't, I promise you this tale will open your eyes to just how quickly love can twist into greed when money is involved. That Friday deadline they gave me, it became the day they would regret underestimating me. And I can't wait to tell you exactly how it unfolded. The moment I revealed that calm smile instead of panic, the energy in the room shifted. My parents expected me to crumble, maybe even beg them for time. They thought they held all the power. But if there's one thing my grandparents taught me, it's that control only belongs to those who prepare for the storm before it hits. I had done exactly that. I could see the confusion flicker across my father's face. He was waiting for the explosion. The tears, maybe even me running upstairs to grab a suitcase. Instead, I folded my arms and leaned against the doorframe like I had all the time in the world. That moment wasn't just defiance. It was the silent declaration that the battleground wasn't theirs to choose anymore. Now, before I continue deeper into the mess that was about to unravel, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments below. And if this story already resonates with you, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, the way this drama unfolds is unlike anything you've heard before. You see, I knew my parents' pattern. Every scheme they touched turned to dust, failed businesses, bankruptcy filings, desperate attempts to borrow money from relatives and neighbors. They weren't strategists, they were opportunists. The only reason they thought this plan would succeed was because they believed I was still the little boy they'd abandoned years ago. They had no idea that abandonment had turned into fuel, that I had built a career in the very arena they were trying to play in. My sister Valerie leaned in, smirking. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Danny. We already have buyers lined up. Buyers. She said it like she was talking about unloading used furniture at a yard sale, not selling off 3 generations of legacy. That's when I realized they weren't just dabbling in greed this time. They had already put the wheels in motion. I glanced at the papers my father was waving. I didn't even need to touch them to know what they were: amateur forgeries dressed up as legal documents, wrong signatures, mismatched dates, maybe even notary stamps pulled off some cheap website. It was the kind of thing they thought no one would question, because in their minds, the family name was power enough. They never considered the possibility that I, the child they dismissed as weak, had turned into someone who understood every legal line, every loophole, every weapon they thought to wield. Inside, I wanted to laugh, but instead I just said, "You really think I would let that happen?" My voice wasn't raised. It was almost gentle, which somehow cut deeper. Because in that instant, they realized I wasn't cornered prey. I was the hunter who had been waiting. What my parents didn't understand was that this fight wasn't about money. It was about dignity. It was about loyalty. It was about protecting the only 2 people in my life who had ever chosen me over themselves, my grandparents. When I signed those trust documents months earlier, it wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a promise. A vow to honor the sacrifices they had made when they raised me instead of leaving me behind like my parents had. The irony was almost poetic. My parents thought they were ambushing me with their victory, but really, they were walking into the trap of their own arrogance. They couldn't fathom that I had already anticipated this exact moment. They couldn't see that their greed had become predictable, almost scripted. And that predictability was the very thing that doomed them. So I stood there, letting the silence stretch, watching their confidence drip away drop by drop. They didn't know it yet, but that was the last time they would ever have the upper hand over me. The house, the estate, the history, it was all shielded. Their papers meant nothing. Their threats meant nothing. Looking back now, that moment was more than just the opening shot of a family war. It was a revelation. Sometimes the people who share your blood believe that gives them the right to share your soul, your legacy, your future. But the truth, family, isn't about shared DNA. It's about shared values. And if they won't protect those values, then you must. Alone, if you have to. So when my father leaned forward, his grin twisting into frustration, I leaned even further into my calm. Because deep down, I knew the storm they thought they were bringing had already passed, and I was still standing. I grew up in a house where silence carried more weight than words. Not the peaceful kind of silence you get on a quiet Sunday morning, but the heavy kind, the kind that comes when people who should be there simply aren't. My earliest memories of my parents are of suitcases by the door, hurried phone calls, and promises that never survived the week. They weren't cruel in the obvious sense. They were worse. They were absent. By the time I was 5, their absences had become permanent. My grandparents, Henry and Louise Carter, didn't hesitate. They opened their front door, ushered me into their lives, and never once made me feel like I was a burden. While my parents chased business schemes across state lines, selling everything from miracle vitamins to fake real estate investments, I was learning how to tie my shoes with Grandpa's steady hands guiding me and baking cookies at Grandma's side. The house wasn't grand by most people's standards, an old colonial with creaking stairs and wallpaper that hadn't changed since the 70s, but to me it was a fortress. Every corner held a memory that stitched me closer to them. The back porch where Grandpa taught me how to whittle sticks into toy boats. The kitchen where Grandma insisted I try to memorize her recipes, saying, "One day you'll need to know how to feed yourself and someone you love." She said it with a wink. But underneath, I think she already knew they were raising me to stand alone. Meanwhile, letters from my parents would occasionally arrive, usually around the holidays. Thin envelopes, words scribbled without care, sometimes asking if Grandpa had thought about selling the house, sometimes hinting at how hard life was on the road. The irony stung even as a child. They had abandoned stability to chase riches, but I was the one growing up in wealth, the wealth of love, structure, and safety. Grandpa Henry was a man of principles. He had worked 30 years at a steel plant and spent his weekends volunteering at the local library, tutoring kids who couldn't afford extra help. He believed in 2 things above all: honesty and hard work. Daniel. He'd tell me, your word is your bond. Break it, and you'll lose something no money can buy back. Those words clung to me like armor, echoing in my head during every decision I made later in life. Grandma Louise balanced him perfectly. Where he was stern and disciplined, she was warm and imaginative. She believed education was the one inheritance no one could steal. When money was tight, instead of buying me the newest gadgets, she'd scrape together enough for museum membership, secondhand books, or trips to historical sites. It wasn't about prestige, it was about giving me tools to dream beyond what I saw in front of me. And though I was too young to fully understand it, I felt the weight of their sacrifices. Grandpa worked odd jobs long after retirement age, mowing lawns and repairing fences just to keep the property taxes covered. Grandma clipped coupons with surgical precision, stretching every dollar. Yet they never once made me feel like a burden. If anything, they made me believe I was the reason to keep going. The contrast between them and my parents couldn't have been sharper. When my parents did appear, usually around Christmas, it was a parade of false affection. Hugs that smelled like cheap cologne, and desperation gifts wrapped hastily, followed by probing questions. "How's the old place holding up, Henry? Have you thought about downsizing?" I may have been young, but even then I could see through it. Their visits weren't about me. They were about the house, the land, the bank accounts they thought were waiting. That's when I learned my first hard truth: family is not about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up when you need them. My grandparents showed up every single day. They showed up with hot meals, bedtime stories, and unconditional love. My parents, they showed up only when there was something to take. Looking back now, I realize that foundation, those years wrapped in the steady rhythm of my grandparents' care, was the only reason I could later face the storm that came. Without it, I might have crumbled the moment my parents tried to erase me from my own life. But because of them, I had roots deeper than any scheme could pull out. So when I say this fight over the estate wasn't about money, I mean it. It was about protecting the only home where I was ever truly seen. It was about defending the people who had chosen me when others wouldn't. And if you've ever had someone step in when the world abandoned you, you'll understand loyalty isn't a transaction, it's a lifeline. That's what my grandparents gave me. And that's what I swore to protect, no matter the cost. My parents never really learned the meaning of stability. For them, life was one long gamble, always chasing the next big payout, always convinced that the corner they were about to turn would finally lead to fortune. But it never did. What it led to was ruin, humiliation, and the kind of desperation that turns people into predators rather than providers. By the time I was 10, my father had already filed for bankruptcy twice. The first time he blamed the unfair system that shut down his chain of video rental stores when streaming began to rise. The second time he claimed a crooked partner tanked his real estate venture. I was too young to understand the intricacies of business law, but I was old enough to recognize a pattern. Nothing was ever his fault, and every failure was just fuel for the next scheme. My mother was no different. She had a gift for persuasion, but she used it like a con artist instead of a leader. I watched her sell Neighbors on miracle diet pills one year, then pivot to timeshares in Florida the next, then to can't-miss investments in imported jewelry. Each venture fizzled, leaving behind angry customers and unpaid bills. She wore charm like a mask, but beneath it was the same entitlement that fueled my father. The world owed them success, and if it didn't deliver, they would simply take from whoever was closest. And then there was my sister Valerie. 7 years younger than me, she grew up immersed in their toxic mindset. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if she'd been raised by my grandparents too. Maybe she would have had a chance at a different kind of life. But instead, she became their shadow. She learned quickly that manipulation could get her anything she wanted. By her teenage years, she had perfected the art of crocodile tears, the pout that convinced my parents she deserved more than she had, and the shamelessness to steal without remorse. One Christmas stands out. Valerie was about 10 and I was 17. She came to visit with my parents, who were already buzzing with their usual false cheer. That night, while everyone else was in the living room, she slipped into my room and emptied the piggy bank I'd been filling for months. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She just smirked and said, "You'll get more anyway. Grandpa always gives you money." It wasn't just the theft, it was the certainty in her voice, the belief that she was entitled to take because in her world everything was up for grabs. My grandparents, bless them, still hoped she could be saved. I remember Grandma once saying softly, "Maybe Valerie should stay with us for a while. She needs guidance." but my parents refused outright. Valerie was their baby, their project. And in truth, she was their reflection. She didn't demand much parenting, because she didn't want structure, she wanted freedom to manipulate, to coast, to mirror their habits. As my grandparents aged those visits from my parents, and Valerie grew sharper, more uncomfortable, they'd arrive with big smiles and exaggerated hugs, then shift almost immediately into questions about the house. "It must be too much for you two now," Dad would say. Or Mom would flip through retirement community brochures she just happened to have in her purse. Valerie, by then in her teens, would wander through the house, touching everything like she was taking inventory. Their intentions weren't subtle. They weren't even careful anymore. The truth was glaring, and it haunted me. They weren't family anymore. They were scavengers, circling, waiting for weakness. And the worst part? They were circling people who still loved them. People who wanted to believe the best, despite decades of evidence. My grandparents' loyalty to their own son blinded them to the danger. But I wasn't blind. I saw exactly what was happening. That's when I made a vow to myself. If my parents and sister thought they could strip away everything my grandparents built, they were in for a fight they couldn't win. I may have been young, but I understood something they never would. Real wealth isn't about quick wins or flashy payouts. It's about legacy. It's about trust, loyalty, and sacrifice. So while my parents kept scheming, I kept preparing. Every lie they told, every manipulation they tried, every question they asked about the paperwork, I logged it in my mind like evidence. Because deep down, I knew a day would come when all of this would boil over. And when it did, I wasn't going to be the helpless child they thought I was. I was going to be the one with the power to stop them. That day wasn't here yet, but it was coming, and I could already feel the storm building. When I tell people why I chose law, most expect a polished answer, something about ambition, prestige, or the promise of financial stability. But the truth is far less glamorous. The seed was planted on a night that left me shaken long before I ever cracked open a law textbook. I was a senior in high school when the Wilsons, an elderly couple who lived 3 streets away, lost everything. Mr. Wilson had trusted his only son with power of attorney, believing it would make their lives easier as health issues mounted. Instead, within months, the son emptied their accounts, sold off their retirement investments, and left them with nothing. I remember the night it all came crashing down because my grandfather came home angrier than I'd ever seen him. They gave him everything, Grandpa muttered, pacing the kitchen, and he left them with crumbs. His voice shook, not just with anger, but with grief. He had fought beside Mr. Wilson in the local union years earlier, trusted him, respected him. Now he was watching a man who had worked his entire life reduced to begging neighbors for help with utilities. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the Wilsons sitting on their porch heads, bowed their son's expensive car, gleaming in the driveway as if mocking them. That night, Grandma put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Daniel, sometimes the cruelest thieves are the ones who share your last name." Those words lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't shake. I lay awake for hours, replaying the scene, thinking about how betrayal from strangers is painful, but expected, while betrayal from family is like poison. It spreads through everything you thought was safe. From that moment, the law stopped being abstract. It became a shield. I started reading about estate planning, trusts, wills, subjects that would bore most 17-year-olds. I wanted to know, how do you stop exploitation when it comes from inside the family? How do you protect people who don't even realize they're vulnerable until it's too late? That's when my focus sharpened. While classmates were dreaming about big universities far away, I was already mapping out how to stay close to my grandparents while studying law. I couldn't shake the fear that my parents would one day pull the same stunt as the Wilsons' son. Every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance at the property, every question about future plans confirmed it. They were circling, and I needed to be ready. Grandpa noticed my obsession. One evening, he found me buried in a book on contracts from the library. He chuckled softly. "Most kids your age are sneaking out to parties, and here you are learning how to write clauses." But then his tone shifted serious. "If you're going to walk this path, Daniel, don't do it for money. Do it because you believe in it. Because people like the Wilsons need someone on their side." That night I promised him I would. Not just in words, but in action. I started volunteering at the library to help seniors with basic paperwork, renewing licenses. understanding bank forms, avoiding scams. It might have seemed small, but to me it was training. Every story I heard made me more determined. And then came the moment that solidified everything, a knock at our door, late one evening. Mrs. Wilson stood there, tears streaking down her face, asking Grandpa if he could recommend a lawyer. I'll never forget the way Grandpa's eyes shifted to me, as if silently passing a baton I hadn't yet earned. That was the night I decided, not hoped, not dreamed, but decided that I would become the kind of lawyer who could stand between families like mine and vultures like my parents. Funny thing is, my parents never noticed. They thought my long nights at the library were wasted time. "He's too soft," my father scoffed once. "He'll never make money babysitting old folks' paperwork." What he didn't know was that every page I read, every conversation I had was preparing me for the day he himself would try to cross the line. That day was still years away, but the fire was already lit. And once lit, it only grew. Now let me ask you this, if you were in my shoes back then, watching neighbors lose everything to their own child, what would you have done? Would you confront them or quietly prepare like I did? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Because in the end, that decision to prepare silently, instead of shouting into the wind, changed everything about how my story would unfold. By the time I entered college, the storm clouds were already gathering. My parents had been gone for years, only swooping back into my life when they smelled opportunity. As my grandparents aged, their visits became more frequent, but not out of love or duty. No, it was something colder, sharper. They weren't checking on my grandparents' health. They were checking on their assets. It started subtly. My father would call once a month, his tone fake cheerful, before slipping in questions. "So how's Dad doing? Still managing the stairs okay? Has he thought about selling yet?" He'd phrase it as concern, but I could hear the calculation behind every word. My mother took a different tack, emailing links to retirement communities saying things like, "A house that size must be too much for them now." She framed it as practicality, but I knew what she really meant. Move them out so we can move in. Then there was Valerie. She'd come over and stroll through the house like a tourist in a museum, running her hands over antique cabinets, opening drawers when she thought no one was looking. Once I caught her in Grandpa's study holding one of his fountain pens as if testing its worth. When I asked what she was doing, she smirked and said, "Just making sure nothing gets lost." It made my stomach turn, because I saw the same smirk on my father's face when he talked about opportunities. I saw the same gleam in my mother's eyes when she sized up furniture like dollar signs. Valerie had become their echo, only younger, hungrier, and with fewer boundaries. My grandparents, though, struggled to see it. Grandpa was still clinging to hope that his son might one day prove trustworthy. "He's many things, Daniel," he'd say, "but he's still my boy." Grandma would sit quietly, twisting her wedding ring whenever the subject came up, as though the act of fiddling with the gold band could keep her family from fracturing completely. But I couldn't ignore it. I saw the pattern too clearly. Every visit ended the same way, smiles fading into whispers, conversations cutting off when I entered the room, hints about responsibility and preparing for the future. They weren't circling out of love. They were vultures waiting for a crack in the armor. And then came the night I found proof. Grandpa had asked me to fix something on his computer, just a printer setting, nothing serious. But while I was there, an email popped up on the screen. It was from my father, sent to a local real estate agent. He wasn't asking about houses to buy. He was asking about comps, comparable sales in the neighborhood. He wanted to know what our house could fetch if it went on the market. I stared at that email so long I felt my vision blur. My father wasn't even hiding it. He was preparing to sell the very walls I grew up in, the home my grandparents had poured their lives into without their knowledge. It wasn't just greed, it was theft in slow motion, dressed up as planning ahead. That night I lay awake with a choice burning in my chest. Do I confront him now, knowing it will drive a wedge through what little family we had left, or do I bide my time, strengthen my knowledge, and wait for the right moment? I chose silence, but not passivity. I doubled down on my law studies. I devoured case law about trusts, probate, estate disputes. Every class became more personal, every example a roadmap for what was coming. Because I knew it wasn't a question of if my parents would make a move, it was only a question of when. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if my grandparents knew more than they admitted. Maybe Grandpa saw the worry in my eyes when I mentioned the calls. Maybe Grandma noticed the way I clenched my jaw when Valerie inspected her jewelry box. But they didn't want to believe their own flesh and blood would betray them. I didn't have that luxury. I had already learned from the Wilsons. I knew what happened when trust was misplaced in the wrong hands. And so I began preparing for the inevitable, the day my family would stop pretending and make their move openly. And let me turn this question to you: if you discovered your own family quietly plotting to sell your home behind your back, what would you do? Would you confront them head-on or quietly prepare for battle? I want to hear your take. Because for me, silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And soon, that strategy would become my shield. The turning point came one rainy Thursday afternoon in my junior year of college. I was sitting in the library, a fortress of silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights, when my phone buzzed with a message from Grandma. It was simple, almost casual. Daniel, your father asked us to sign some papers. Can you look at them? My blood ran cold. I told her not to sign anything until I got there. I raced home, the rain pelting against my windshield, my mind a whirlwind of worst-case scenarios. When I walked through the front door, I found Grandpa sitting in his recliner, with a manila envelope in his lap. The papers were spread out on the coffee table like bait. I scanned them quickly. My father had drafted a transfer of ownership agreement, one that would effectively sign over the deed to the house in his name under the guise of simplifying the estate. There it was in black ink, my grandparents' lifetime of sweat and sacrifice reduced to a signature line. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to stay calm. Don't sign this, I told them firmly. Grandpa frowned, torn between trust in me and loyalty to his son. Grandma clutched her rosary beads, whispering prayers under her breath. That was the moment I knew words alone weren't enough. I needed something stronger. That night, I dove deep into research. I found the tool I'd been searching for all along: a living trust. It was elegant, powerful, and most importantly, airtight if done right. A trust would place the property under legal protection, giving control to the trustees, my grandparents, while preventing anyone else from swooping in. I approached Grandpa the next morning. He was wary, still clinging to hope that my father wasn't as ruthless as I claimed. But when I laid out the papers my father had prepared, the mask finally cracked. For the first time, I saw anger not at me, but at his own son. Let's do it, he said quietly. If it means protecting your grandma, let's do it. So we began. I spent weeks drafting, revising, and consulting every free legal resource I could get my hands on. I attended workshops at the community center, peppered local attorneys with questions, and even shadowed a family law professor who admired my determination. It wasn't easy, but step by step the framework came together. Finally, one crisp autumn afternoon, my grandparents signed the trust documents. I'll never forget the relief on Grandma's face as she put down the pen. It was as if a burden had lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in months, she smiled without strain. The trust was official. The house was no longer a dangling fruit for my parents to snatch. It was protected, shielded from manipulation. My father's signature trick had been outplayed by my preparation. But what I didn't expect was the confrontation that followed. Just a week later, my parents stormed into the house, Valerie trailing behind them like a shadow. My father's voice was ice as he asked, "What have you done?" My mother sneered, accusing me of turning their own parents against them. Valerie just glared, arms crossed, like she'd lost a prize she already believed was hers. I stood my ground, the trust documents secure in my briefcase. For once, I wasn't the nervous kid avoiding conflict. I was the shield my grandparents needed. "You can't touch this house anymore," I said. "It belongs to them. And it will stay that way." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. My mother shook her head in disgust. Valerie muttered something under her breath. Then slowly they left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. That night, Grandpa poured me a glass of his favorite bourbon and raised it in a toast. "To you, Daniel," he said, "for protecting us when we didn't even know how." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a soldier who had won a battle but knew the war was far from over. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: people who hunger for power don't stop when you block them once. They retreat, regroup, and come back harder. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The week after the confrontation, the house was eerily quiet. My grandparents went about their routines. Grandma in the garden, Grandpa tinkering with his radio, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The silence wasn't peace. It was the fragile calm that comes right after a storm. For a few days, my parents didn't call. No unexpected visits. No emails dangling helpful advice about retirement homes. Valerie didn't show up unannounced to check on things. It was as if they had vanished, retreating into the shadows. But I could feel their presence even in absence. Like a pressure in the air, like knowing a wolf was circling the edge of the forest just out of sight. My father wasn't the type to give up. He was the type to bide his time, to wait until he thought my guard was down. Grandpa, however, seemed almost lighter. He'd pour his morning coffee and say things like, "Feels good to know we've got protection now." He believed the trust was an iron wall, and in many ways it was. But as a law student, I knew walls could be scaled, loopholed, challenged. Protection wasn't the same as invincibility. At night, I lay awake, replaying the confrontation. My father's clenched jaw, my mother's sneer, Valerie's cold eyes. They weren't finished. I could almost hear the unspoken promise in that slammed door. This isn't over. Sure enough, subtle cracks began to appear. A few weeks later, Grandma mentioned that Valerie had called just to check in. Then it was a box of pastries left on the porch with a sticky note, "Love you both, hope you're well." Sweet on the surface, sour underneath. These weren't acts of kindness. They were reminders we're still here. We're watching. One afternoon, I caught Grandpa staring at the framed family portrait that hung in the hallway. It was taken years ago, back when my parents still pretended to be involved. Valerie, just a girl in braces. He sighed heavily. "How did it come to this, Daniel?" he asked. I didn't have an easy answer. I told him the truth, that greed had taken root, and sometimes even blood couldn't choke it out. He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on that photo, as if searching for a piece of his son he could still believe in. Meanwhile, I buried myself in my studies. I wasn't just preparing for exams anymore, I was preparing for the next battle. Probate law, contract disputes, fraud cases. I devoured them all. Every page I read was fuel for what I knew was coming. Then came the first real sign of their regrouping. A letter arrived, addressed to my grandparents from an attorney I didn't recognize. It was polite, almost sterile in tone, but the message was clear. My parents were seeking clarification on the trust. Clarification. I laughed bitterly when I read it. That was legal code for challenge. They hadn't disappeared. They'd just traded brute force for strategy. Grandpa's hands trembled as he held the letter. "We did the right thing, didn't we?" he asked, almost pleading. "We did," I said firmly. "This is just their way of testing the fence." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, court filings, injunctions, endless hearings. I pictured my father smirking across a courtroom, Valerie whispering in his ear like a viper. But I also pictured something else, the faces of my grandparents lined with worry, yet trusting me to shield them. That image steadied me. Because if there's one lesson I'd learned from all of this, it's that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes silence is preparation. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that my parents' silence was just that, preparation. The question was no longer if they'd strike again, but how soon. So I made myself a promise under that quiet, restless sky when they came back, and I knew they would. I'd be ready. Not just with knowledge, but with resolve. And the next time they tried to pry open the walls we'd built, they'd discover something they hadn't expected. I wasn't just the scared kid they once abandoned. I was their equal now. And I was no longer afraid. The letter from my parents' attorney was only the first shot across the bow. I knew it. The tone was civil, the language polished, but it reeked of something darker. And sure enough, within weeks the storm broke. One cold Tuesday morning, Grandma opened the mailbox and found a thick envelope, summons papers. My parents had filed a petition to challenge the trust. Their claim that my grandparents had been unduly influenced by me, their grandson. They argued that I'd manipulated two elderly people into giving up control of their estate. I'll never forget the look on Grandma's face. Her hands trembled as she handed me the envelope. "Daniel," she whispered, "they're saying you tricked us." Anger surged through me like fire. It wasn't enough that they wanted the house, they wanted to tarnish me, to paint me as some schemer preying on my own blood. That night, I sat alone at my desk, the summons lying flat before me. I studied every line, every allegation. They wanted to drag us into court where everything would be public, messy, humiliating. For them, it wasn't just about the property anymore. It was about control. It was about making me bend. But here's the truth: I wasn't bending. I threw myself into preparation. I visited legal aid clinics, consulted professors, even reached out to pro bono attorneys. I built binders full of documents, witness statements, financial records, photographs, every scrap of proof that the trust had been signed willingly and knowingly. If they wanted war, I'd give them one they wouldn't forget. Still, doubt crept in late at night. What if the court believed them? What if the law, as airtight as I thought it, was cracked under pressure? I pictured my father smiling in victory, Valerie holding up house keys like a trophy, my mother whispering, "We told you so." But every time fear tried to pull me under, I thought of my grandparents. I thought of their tired eyes, their aching hands, their trust in me. And I knew I couldn't let them down. The first hearing was scheduled for January. The night before, Grandpa poured us both a glass of bourbon, the same ritual as before. He raised his glass, his voice steady despite the storm. "You've done more for us than anyone could ask Daniel. Win or lose, you've already proven yourself." But inside I knew losing wasn't an option. The next morning we walked into the courthouse together. My father was already there, dressed in his sharpest suit, my mother at his side. Valerie sat behind them smirking as if she were already redecorating the house in her mind. When my father caught my eye, he gave a small, mocking nod like this was just a game he'd already won. But as I stood there, trust documents in hand, something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't just about property. It wasn't even just about protecting my grandparents. This was about breaking free from years of control, manipulation, and silence. This was about me finally standing up to the people who had abandoned me, who had treated me like collateral damage in their endless pursuit of power. And that's when it hit me: this battle wasn't just theirs anymore. It was mine. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward as the clerk called our case. My father's smirk widened, but for the first time I didn't feel small. I didn't feel powerless. Because the truth was about to come out, and when it did, it would change everything. And maybe you're wondering right now, what exactly happened inside that courtroom? What did they say, and how did I respond? Well, you're going to want to hear this. The courtroom was colder than I expected, both in temperature and in spirit. Every sound seemed amplified: the shuffle of papers, the click of a pen, the cough of a stranger. My grandparents sat behind me, quiet but resolute, while I stood shoulder to shoulder with the pro bono attorney who had agreed to represent us. Across the aisle, my father looked like a man who thought the victory was already his. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. My mother leaned in close to whisper, her eyes darting toward me with disdain. And then there was Valerie, arms crossed, lips curled in a smile that made my skin crawl. The judge entered and we all rose. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. Their attorney opened first, painting a vivid picture of an impressionable elderly couple, pressured by a manipulative grandson who inserted himself into their financial affairs. He spoke with the confidence of someone who thought charm could bend the truth. He even glanced back at me mid-sentence as if daring me to flinch. But I didn't. When it was our turn, my attorney stood tall and clear-voiced. "Your Honor, what you're hearing is not a case of undue influence. It's a case of greed. We will show evidence that the trust was drafted and signed with full awareness, by choice, and with independent witnesses." He paused, letting the words settle. "And we will show that this petition is nothing more than an attempt to strip these people of the home they've built over decades." As the first witness took the stand, the notary who had overseen the signing of the trust, I felt a small surge of relief. She testified that my grandparents had read the document, carefully asked questions, and signed without hesitation. My parents' attorney tried to rattle her, suggesting she had rushed them, but she stood firm. "No," she said calmly, "they knew exactly what they were doing." Next came the financial advisor, who confirmed that the trust matched their long-term wishes. The more he spoke, the more I saw my father's smirk falter. But then came the moment I dreaded. Their attorney called my grandfather to the stand. "Mr. Carter," he began, voice dripping with politeness, "isn't it true that your grandson was living in your home at the time of the trust's drafting?" "Yes," Grandpa admitted. "And isn't it true he helped organize your finances, drove you to appointments, and advised you on documents?" "Yes." The attorney leaned forward. So isn't it possible, sir, that he influenced your decisions, that he pressured you to sign something you didn't fully understand? The room went quiet, my chest tightened. Grandpa paused, his hands folded, his gaze steady. "Let me tell you something," he said slowly. "That boy didn't pressure me into anything. He saved us. He was the only one who cared enough to help when everyone else disappeared. We made our decision because we trust him, not because he forced us." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the judge raised her eyes briefly from her notes. I glanced at my father, his jaw tightened. Valerie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, their certainty cracked. Still, I knew this was just the beginning. One witness, one statement, it wasn't enough to win. But it was a spark, and sparks have a way of catching fire. When the judge adjourned for the day, my grandparents and I walked out together, heads high. Outside the courthouse, the air felt fresher, like the world had tilted ever so slightly back toward balance. But deep down, I knew we hadn't seen their full playbook yet. My father wasn't a man who surrendered easily. If today was their opening move, tomorrow would be something far harsher. And I had to be ready. Because this trial wasn't just about legal arguments, it was about exposing truth against a tide of lies. And truth, if wielded right, had the power to burn away everything they thought they controlled. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early, clutching my binder like a shield. The courthouse lobby buzzed with chatter, but to me it sounded distant, muted, like I was underwater. I knew today would be different. Today wasn't just about defending against accusations. Today we'd strike back. My father's side looked sharp and smug, as always their attorney polished, rehearsed. They thought yesterday had been a minor hiccup, a bump they could easily smooth out with their stronger evidence. But they didn't know what we had prepared. When the judge called us in, the courtroom felt heavier than before. My grandparents sat firmly behind me, their presence both grounding and heartbreaking. I glanced back at them, and Grandpa gave me the smallest nod. It was enough. Our attorney began by introducing a stack of documents, phone logs, bank statements, and letters. These weren't random scraps of paper. They painted a picture of abandonment. The first exhibit was a series of voicemails from my mother left unanswered for months by her parents. She had called only when she needed money. My attorney played one for the court, her voice sugary sweet at first, then sharp when no one responded. "If you won't help us, don't be surprised when we stop calling." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My father's face turned to stone. Valerie shifted uncomfortably. Next came the bank records showing repeated transfers from my grandparents' account to cover emergencies Valerie had. A car repair tuition she never paid, credit card debt that ballooned without explanation. My grandparents had given and given until they had nothing left to give except their house. The opposing attorney tried to object, but the judge overruled. Every sheet of paper landed like a hammer blow. And then the real twist. I took the stand. My hands trembled, but my voice was clear. I recounted the nights I stayed up sorting unpaid bills, the mornings I drove Grandma to her doctor, the countless meals I cooked when neither of them had the strength. Then I told the court about the day I found my grandfather, sitting alone at the kitchen table, foreclosure letters spread before him. How he had whispered, "I don't want to lose the only place your grandmother and I have ever called home." That was when my voice broke. Not out of weakness, but because the truth demanded it. I didn't pressure them, Your Honor. I listened. I stood beside them when no one else would. If that's considered influence, then I'm guilty of love. But I'll never apologize for it. The courtroom went silent. Even the court reporter paused briefly, her fingers hovering over the keys. My father's attorney scrambled to regain control, throwing out accusations, insinuations. He called me opportunistic, said I had orchestrated all of this for personal gain. But the judge's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the documents again and again. When court adjourned, I walked past my parents without looking at them. My father muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care. I had seen the fear in his eyes, the first hint that his grip on this case was slipping. Outside reporters had gathered, their microphones flashing. "Daniel, do you have any comment?" one asked. I didn't give them much, just one line. The truth always has a way of coming out. As we left, my attorney leaned in. "They're rattled. Tomorrow they'll go for the jugular. Be ready." And I knew he was right. My father had never accepted defeat quietly. If he felt the case slipping, he would dig up something, anything, to destroy me. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window staring at the dark street outside, wondering what tricks he had left. Would he lie outright? Would he try to drag my name through the mud until I had no dignity left? But no matter what he threw, I had already made peace with one thing: I wasn't fighting just for me. I was fighting for the people who had chosen me when the rest of the world turned its back. And if it came to the jugular, I was ready to bite back harder. The third day of the trial felt like walking into a storm I could already smell in the air. The tension was thicker, almost tangible, like static before lightning strikes. I knew my father and his attorney wouldn't play defense today, they would attack. And when people like him feel cornered, they don't just lash out, they aim to destroy. As the proceedings began, their attorney wasted no time. "Your Honor," he announced, holding up a folder thick with papers today, "we will present evidence that Mr. Carter, his finger stabbed toward me, exploited his grandparents financially and emotionally, manipulating them into cutting their rightful heirs out of the estate." The words hit the air heavy, and I braced myself. He called the first witness a neighbor. She shuffled nervously to the stand, then began reciting a story that sounded rehearsed. According to her, I rarely let my grandparents make their own decisions, and I had raised my voice more than once. It stung because, yes, I had raised my voice, but only when I found overdue bills hidden in drawers, or when I caught Valerie siphoning money under the guise of loans. The attorney twisted frustration born of love into the image of coercion. Then came the real blow. He pulled out photographs, grainy shots of me carrying folders, stacks of mail, even signing papers at the kitchen table. Out of context, they looked sinister. "See," he argued, "this is a young man controlling every aspect of his grandparents' lives." I clenched my fists under the table. They were framing my care as control, my responsibility as dominance. But the worst moment came when they introduced a financial statement. A transfer of $5,000 directly into my account. My father's attorney raised his brows theatrically. And here we have proof that the grandson benefited directly from their so-called generosity. "Isn't it convenient?" Gasps rippled through the room. My stomach dropped. That money had been a gift, unexpected, unrequested, after I had paid months of medical bills out of my own pocket. My grandparents had insisted writing for Daniel's sacrifices in the memo line, but stripped of that context, it looked damning. I turned to look at them. Grandma's eyes shimmered with tears. Grandpa clenched his cane knuckles white. My heart ached, not because I feared losing, but because I knew how much it hurt them to watch me dragged through the mud. When the judge called a recess, I stepped outside to breathe. Reporters swarmed, their questions sharp as daggers. "Daniel, did you take money from your grandparents? Are you exploiting them for their property?" I kept my voice steady. Every dollar I've ever received was given freely. And unlike others, I never asked for it. But inside, doubt gnawed at me. Would the jury see through the smear? Would they understand that care is messy, that love doesn't come with neat records? My attorney pulled me aside. "They're desperate. This is their last card before we present the ironclad piece." "The ironclad piece?" I asked. He nodded but didn't elaborate. "Not yet. Timing is everything. We'll use it when it will break them completely." I felt a shiver, an open loop. Something big was waiting, something I hadn't even seen yet. Back in the courtroom, the opposing side strutted with confidence. They believed they had sunk me with selective truths and twisted images. My father leaned back, arms folded, a smirk tugging at his lips. Valerie whispered something to him, and they both laughed quietly, as though the victory was already theirs. But I knew better. The truth wasn't a fragile thing, it was a blade. And while they thought they were tightening the noose, they hadn't realized I was holding something sharp enough to cut it. I didn't know exactly what my attorney was saving for the right moment, but I could feel it coming. A storm inside a storm. And when it broke, it wouldn't just clear my name. It would expose theirs. When court reconvened the next day, the air felt different. The opposing side walked in like victors returning for their crown, their confidence inflated by yesterday's theatrics. My father even patted his attorney's back, grinning as though the matter had already been sealed. But I could sense the undertow shifting like the moment before an earthquake cracks the ground. Our attorney stood calmly, a single folder in his hands. No theatrics, no stacks of paper, just one folder. He waited until the murmurs quieted before speaking. "Your Honor, with permission, we'd like to present Exhibit 47. This evidence was submitted late only because it only became available through a subpoena last week." The judge allowed it. The bailiff handed over a slim stack of papers. At first, I didn't recognize what I was seeing. Then my stomach twisted. They were emails between my father and Valerie. The attorney cleared his throat. Let me read one aloud. He began, voice steady but sharp. Mom doesn't need the house, she barely leaves the chair. If we sell it now, we can split the proceeds before Daniel sticks his claws in further. The courtroom gasped. My father's smirk vanished, Valerie's face drained of color. Another email followed. I've already arranged for a private buyer. Once they're in assisted living, we'll offload the property fast. Don't worry, I've handled the documents they'll sign without even realizing. Every word landed like dynamite. My grandparents sat frozen tears sliding silently down Grandma's cheeks. My grandfather closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly, as though each sentence confirmed his worst fear. The opposing attorney stammered, trying to object. Context. These could be taken out of context, but the judge raised her hand. The words are clear. Sit down. And just like that, the narrative flipped. Yesterday, I was the manipulator, the schemer. Today, the curtain had been pulled back, exposing who the real architects of coercion had been all along. But my attorney wasn't finished. He clicked a remote and the courtroom monitor lit up, a video recording. My breath caught. I hadn't seen this before. It showed Valerie in the kitchen, her voice sharp, impatient. Just sign it, Dad. It's only paperwork. Don't make this harder. My grandfather's weak protest. I don't understand what this is for. Valerie's cold reply. You don't need to. Just trust me. Gasps again. Reporters scribbled furiously. My father looked as though someone had drained the blood from his body. And here's where the irony twisted deeper. The video wasn't captured by me or even by a private investigator. It had been recorded accidentally by a caregiver's phone left running on the counter. A stroke of fate, a truth caught in passing. The opposing side scrambled, but it was over. The court had seen. The jury had seen. More importantly, my grandparents had seen. I'll never forget Grandma turning to me, her trembling hand reaching for mine. She whispered, "You told us the truth. We didn't want to believe it, but you never stopped fighting for us." In that moment, I realized this wasn't about property, money, or inheritance. It was about who had stood beside them when they were most vulnerable. And now everyone could see it clearly. But the trial wasn't over yet. The judge called for a break before final arguments. My attorney leaned close. We've gutted their credibility, Daniel, but don't relax yet. They'll try something desperate in closing. People like your father don't just walk away, they thrash until the end. I nodded, though inside something shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to their blows. I was watching them unravel piece by piece. As I stepped out into the hallway, reporters swarmed again, their questions frantic. Did you know about the emails? Did you plan this? I didn't answer. I just looked into the cameras and said, the truth doesn't need planning, it just needs daylight. And I knew tomorrow daylight would come. The morning of final arguments arrived heavy with tension, as though the courthouse itself knew this was the day it would all come to a head. The gallery was packed tighter than ever, reporters elbowing for space, neighbors whispering about betrayals they never thought they'd see spill out in public. My father entered in silence, his swagger gone, his eyes darting like a man searching for a lifeline in deep water. Valerie trailed behind her, confidence cracked into nervous fidgeting. The judge gave a sharp nod, and their attorney stood first. He was sweating, already tugging at his collar. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice thinner than before. What you saw yesterday, those emails, that video, it's all misleading. Family conversations taken out of context. My clients never intended harm. They were discussing options in a moment of stress, worried about the financial future. That is not a crime. That is love misinterpreted. It was a desperate plea, but then came the dagger. He turned, pointing at me. And yet we cannot forget this young man benefited financially. A $5,000 transfer. He claims it was a gift, but gifts can also be manipulations. He is no saint. He is a calculating opportunist. I could feel the jury's eyes on me. My pulse hammered. They were reaching for any last thread, trying to cast even a shadow of doubt. When their side rested, my attorney rose with quiet confidence. He didn't shuffle papers, didn't pace. He just stepped into the center of the courtroom and let silence linger until the air was thick enough to cut. Ladies and gentlemen, he said finally, love is not coercion, care is not control, and gifts given freely are not theft. He paused, then raised the printed emails. These words are not taken out of context. They are plain, unvarnished intent to strip vulnerable elders of their home, their dignity, and their agency. If you believe that is love, then the word has lost all meaning. He let the words hang, then gestured toward the screen where Valerie's video clip had been frozen mid-frame, her hand pressing a pen into my grandfather's. This is not concern. This is coercion. Then softer. Ask yourselves, who sat by hospital beds at 3 a.m., who drove miles in storms for prescriptions, who slept on the couch so they wouldn't wake up alone? Was it the ones who schemed for property, or was it the one they now try to smear? He turned slightly locking eyes with each juror. The truth isn't complicated, it's sitting right in front of you. His words settled like stones. Even the judge leaned back, her expression grave but composed. As the court recessed before deliberation, I finally exhaled. For months, I'd carried the weight of being cast as both villain and savior. Now it was in the jury's hands. In the hallway, Valerie tried to brush past me, but for the first time she didn't glare. She whispered, almost trembling, "You'll regret this." I met her eyes. "The only regret I'll have," I said, is if I'd stayed silent. My father stood a few feet away, staring blankly at the floor. No words left. No defenses. Only the quiet unraveling of a man who had gambled everything and watched it slip through his fingers. Outside, cameras flashed. Questions rang out. I didn't answer. I just lifted my head toward the sky, the autumn light breaking through clouds. Because whatever the verdict, the truth was already free. And deep down, I sensed the jury would not take long. The jury filed back into the courtroom faster than anyone expected. Barely 2 hours had passed since they'd disappeared into deliberation, but in those short hours, my life felt suspended like the pause between lightning and thunder. My palms were damp, my throat dry, but my gaze stayed fixed on the doors until they opened again. The foreman stood, a folded sheet in his hand. He looked toward the judge, then to the courtroom packed with people who held their breath in collective anticipation. The judge asked the question, her voice measured but resonant. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman replied. Every beat of my heart felt like a drum inside my chest. The verdict was read slowly, each word deliberate, on the claim of undue influence and coercion. "We find in favor of the defendant, Daniel Carter." The words slammed into the room like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted, then silence fell heavy, almost sacred. My knees weakened, but I stayed upright, my fists clenched against the table. The judge nodded, her face firm, but not unkind. "The will stands as written. Furthermore, due to evidence of coercion and attempted fraud, this court orders a formal review of property transfers involving the plaintiffs. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Just like that, it was over. Valerie let out a strangled cry, her mask shattering in public view. My father slumped into his chair, a hollow shell of the man who once boasted he'd never lose. The attorney gathered his papers with shaking hands, already calculating how to spin a loss this catastrophic. And me, I turned to see my grandparents. Tears streamed down Grandma's face, but this time they weren't from pain or fear. She reached for me, whispering, "You saved us." Grandpa nodded, his old eyes shining with quiet pride. Reporters swarmed as we left the courthouse, their microphones thrust forward, their voices sharp with questions. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, the autumn wind sweeping around me. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the moment. I raised my voice not for the press, but for the countless others watching from home. This was never about money. It was about dignity, about standing with those who can't fight alone. And if you ever find yourself in that position, don't stay silent. Don't let fear dictate the truth. The crowd stirred, some clapping, some wiping tears. For the first time in months, I felt the weight slide off my shoulders. Later that night, back at my apartment, I sat in silence. No more courtrooms, no more battles, just quiet. Yet my mind wouldn't rest. I replayed every moment, the accusations, the betrayals, the sleepless nights. I thought of the people who doubted me and those who stood with me when it mattered most. And then it hit me, this wasn't just my story. It was a mirror for so many others. Families torn apart, voices, silenced, truths buried. What happened here wasn't rare, it was simply exposed. That's why I'm sharing this now. Because silence only protects the guilty, and sometimes telling the story is the only way to keep the light alive. So if you followed me this far, don't let it end here. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and join this community that believes in truth over convenience, in dignity over greed. Because stories like mine, they don't just end, they ripple. And your voice could be the next spark someone else needs. When the dust settled, life didn't suddenly become perfect. The scars were still there, the betrayal of my father, the venom of Valerie, the long months of doubt. But as days turned into weeks, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I began spending weekends with my grandparents in their little house, the same home my father had tried to take. We cooked simple meals together, sat on the porch watching the seasons shift, and laughed at stories I'd heard 100 times before, but never really listened to. Their presence, once overshadowed by fear, became a kind of anchor. Neighbors began stopping by, not just to congratulate me, but to share their own hidden battles. One woman whispered about her brother trying to cut her out of their mother's estate. Another man spoke quietly about being pressured to give up his inheritance. I realized then that my fight hadn't just been mine. It was a thread in a much larger tapestry of silent struggles. In telling my story, I had given others permission to tell theirs. And in their voices, I heard echoes of my own pain, but also sparks of resilience. I don't hate my father, I can't. But I no longer carry the weight of trying to understand him. His choices were his, and their consequences too. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing, it means freeing yourself from the chains of bitterness. As I sit here now, I understand something vital: freedom isn't just about winning in court. It's about reclaiming the right to live without fear, to love, without condition, to speak without silence. And that's the story I'll keep telling, because sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that matter most.